Let's bring in now Australia's former ambassador to Israel and Liberal MP Dave Sharma. Thank you very much for your time, Dave. I'm going to come to the federal election in a moment. But first, what's your reaction to these comments that we've just seen, Albanese's long-held views on Israel?
Well, I think they're very troubling, Sharri. I mean, I don't think they're consistent with mainstream Australian views. They're obviously quite strongly held and consistently expressed beliefs of Anthony Albanese that all of the fault, if you like, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lies only with one side. He continuously describes Israel as the aggressor nation. He continually adopts the Palestinian national narrative about where the fault is in this conflict. It's certainly out of the mainstream view of, the traditional Labor Party position on this, which has been strong support for Israel. And as far as I'm aware, he hasn't ever, walked back or walked away from these comments. And I think people have a right to know about these views and have a right to know whether he still holds them and whether he will implement them if he's elected as Prime Minister.
Look, this is what I'm really interested in now. So, Anthony Albanese will say now that he does support Israel's right to exist. He's not the only Labor MP, far from it, who holds quite strong views and has expressed them in the past, even the recent past, as I've reported on this show, when it comes to Israel and Palestinian territories. What does this mean for the foreign policies that Australian Labor, if it wins the election, that it could implement? What would be a departure from Australia and the United States, long-held policies on the Middle East?
Well, look, I think first of all you'd see, and he already made this very clear in his interview from 2018, the cessation of Australian support for Israel in international forums. He made quite clear that he would no longer be a supporter of Israel against the UN and its investigative machinery. He's also made clear that his voting patterns, or in Australia's voting patterns in support of Israel's right to defend itself in the UN, at the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, would no longer be the case. But we could also quite feasibly see quite big departures from a traditional policy, including unilateral steps to recognise the state of Palestine, absent a negotiated solution to the conflict. Now, that has been long-standing bipartisan policy, that a two-state solution requires negotiation and agreement between the parties. And what we've seen in various state Labor platforms in recent years, and what we've seen people like Bob Carr agitate for, is to impose an Australian view of the solution to the conflict upon the people and unilaterally recognise the state of Palestine, even if the Palestinians have not forsworn terror, even if the Palestinians do not accept Israel's right to exist, even if the Palestinians are not prepared to respect international borders. And that would be a gross departure from, traditional Australian foreign policy, but also from those of our allies, like the United States, like the United Kingdom, like most countries in Europe.
Turning to Wentworth now, you're facing a tough battle against independent Allegra Spender. How do you feel your prospects are going at this point, 1 week out?
Look, it's certainly a tight and competitive contest, but I've been pleased with the reaction that I've heard from people on the ground. And I think, and this goes back to your previous point, though, I think one thing that people are coming to terms with is if you put an independent in this seat of Wentworth, it's likely that you're going to have a Labor Greens independent government. And as you know, there's a sizable community here that cares very much about Israel and Australia's support for Israel. And you're quite clearly going to get a different position from a Labor Greens independent government on this issue than you are from a coalition government. And I think that's a very important thing for people to recognise. People shouldn't be taking Australia's strong support for Israel for granted, either in Wentworth or anywhere else around the country, frankly, because I think we're going to see two quite starkly different positions, either a Labor Greens independent government position or the coalition position, which will continue to be strong and steadfast in its support for Israel.
In the past couple of days, we've seen the Prime Minister say he'd change, be less of a bulldozer, his words. This is an acknowledgement that some undecided voters, particularly in seats like yours, don't like him. Has this been a message that's come across as you've been at polling booths and out campaigning?
Look, I think people around Australia, including in Wentworth, have had a pretty tough last couple of years, whether it's being cut off from friends and family overseas, whether it's their business under pressure, whether it's their household under pressure, whether it's elderly relatives in aged care homes that they've been, deeply concerned about. All these sorts of things I think have been, weighing on the minds and weighing on the nerves of people as well. And it's natural in that scenario to, attach blame to someone. And undoubtedly the Prime Minister and the federal government and Scott Morrison have attracted some of that blame and some of the frustration and some of the anxiety that people have felt. So, I don't discount that. I don't diminish it. But
do you think it'll cost you
a tough time for...
Do you think it'll cost you your seat? Is it feeling more like 2018 when you lost or 2019 when you won?
No, look, I'm relatively positive whilst taking nothing for granted. I think people fundamentally recognise that we as a government have done a very credible job internationally and domestically in getting Australia through this crisis.
Yeah, all right.
And they recognise that with all these storm clouds gathering, growing inflationary pressures, growing economic uncertainty around the world, China's growing aggressiveness and assertiveness, they really want the certainty and stability that a coalition government can offer that has a strong track record on defence, that has a strong track record on the economy, that will give the country stability at a time of quite considerable global instability.
Okay.
That's the message I've been hearing from people at the early voting stations.
All right. Dave Sharma, thank you very much for your time this evening.